My name is Amara Osei-Bonsu. I am 34 years old. I want to start with the soup. Not because the soup is where the story ends, because the story does not end at soup. Stories involving mothers-in-law and miscarriages and cancer and 3 years of a specific kind of silence rarely end at soup. But the soup is where the shape of everything that came before it became fully visible to me and to the woman lying in the guest room of my house in Cincinnati, Ohio, who had spent 2 years of my marriage to her son, making a specific argument about who I was and what I was capable of, and whether the grief I had expressed was real. The soup was a tomato bisque, from a recipe my mother had made every time anyone in our family was sick, the particular warm, dense soup of someone who understood that food for sick people needed to be the specific kind of thing that required no effort to receive, and that felt like being taken care of from the inside. I had made it for myself 3 times across the years I was trying to get pregnant, on the specific bad days when what I needed was something warm and dense, and exactly like being taken care of by my mother. I had made it for my husband Daniel when he had pneumonia in our 2nd year of marriage. I had made it for my father when he had his knee replacement last year. I made it for Gloria Osei on a Wednesday afternoon in January, 2 years ago, and I carried it from the kitchen to the guest room at the back of our house, and I knocked on the door, and she said, "Come in," and I went in, and I set the soup on the nightstand, and I looked at my husband's mother, who was 62 years old, and who had been in my guest room for 3 weeks, because the specific combination of her cancer treatment schedule and her apartment's inadequate heating, and the particular fact that her daughter lived in Atlanta and her son lived in Cincinnati, and her son's wife had offered the guest room had produced this arrangement. She looked at the soup. Then she looked at me. She said, "Amara," I said, "it's tomato bisque. From my mother's recipe. Eat it while it's warm." She said, "Amara, I need to say something to you." I said, "You can say it after the soup." She said, "No, I need to say it now." I said, "Gloria, the soup is hot and you need calories, and whatever you need to say will still be true in 20 minutes. Eat first." She looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of someone who has prepared what they are going to say, and who is encountering an unexpected obstacle in the form of someone prioritizing the practical over the conversational. She picked up the spoon. I sat in the chair beside the nightstand and waited. She ate approximately half the soup. Then she put the spoon down and she looked at me and she said the specific thing I had not known she was going to say, and that I want to tell you with the accuracy it deserves. She said, "I told Daniel your miscarriage was faked." I said, "I know." She said, "You knew?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since the week it happened." She was very still. She said, "He told you." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you stayed?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because he is my husband, and because I understood what was happening, even if the understanding took some time to arrive at." She said, "What was happening?" I said, "You were afraid of losing your son. You had a specific history with women who came into your family, and you were applying that history to me without knowing me specifically enough to know that I was not those women. And the miscarriage was the specific moment when your fear found something to organize itself around." She said, "That is a generous interpretation." I said, "It is an accurate one. I'm not saying it to be generous. I'm saying it because I spent 3 years understanding it, and I believe it is what was happening." She said, "I was wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have known I was wrong since approximately 6 months after I said it. When you got pregnant again and the pregnancy was difficult and you did not say a word to Daniel about how difficult it was because you were afraid of what happened the last time, and I watched you go through the 3rd trimester, not letting him support you the way you needed to be supported because you were protecting yourself from a weapon I had given him." She said, "I watched that and I understood what I had done." She said, And then the baby came, and she was fine and you were fine. And I told myself that it was over, and that the damage I had done had been absorbed, and that saying something would only make it worse. She said, I was still wrong. Saying something would have been better. Saying nothing was the easier choice, and I chose the easier choice. I said, Gloria, she said, let me finish. I said, all right. She said, I am lying in your guest room because you offered it when your daughter-in-law, who lives in Atlanta, could not make her schedule work, and my apartment is inadequately heated, and my son lives here, and I have nowhere else to go. You offered it without being asked. You have been making me soup and driving me to treatment and sitting in the waiting room, and you have not said one word about what I said 3 years ago, not one word, and I have been lying here for 3 weeks trying to understand how a person does that. She said, I think you are doing it because of who you are and not because of who I have been to you, and I want to tell you that I understand the difference and that I am sorry. Specifically. For the specific thing I said and for the 3 years I let it stand without correcting it. I looked at Gloria Osei, 62 years old, in the guest room of my house, with the tomato bisque half-eaten on the nightstand. I said, I know. She said, You're not going to make this easier for me, are you? I said, No. She said, Good. It shouldn't be easy. I said, No. She said, Amara. The baby. I said, Mia. She said, Mia. Can I be her grandmother? A real one? Not the one I have been, which is the one who shows up for the Christmas photographs and who does not say the true things. A real one. I looked at this woman who had tried to remove me from my own marriage with a specific lie about the worst thing that had happened to me and who was now asking me, from my guest room, whether she could be a real grandmother to my daughter. I said, Yes, you can be her grandmother, but not today. Today you are going to finish the soup and you are going to rest, and we are going to talk about what happened 3 years ago properly. Not today, but soon. And we are going to talk about it honestly because Mia deserves to have a grandmother who knows how to be honest, and we are going to build that from the truth rather than from the version that was easier to tell. She said, Yes. I said, Finish the soup. She finished the soup. Before I take you back to the beginning and the specific night Daniel came home and told me what his mother had said, let me tell you one more thing about that January afternoon in the guest room, because there is a detail I have not mentioned yet that is the specific thing that makes the room comprehensible. On the nightstand beside the soup bowl, underneath the lamp, was a manila envelope. I had placed it there 3 weeks earlier when Gloria arrived, the first day when Daniel was helping her get settled, and I was making up the bed, and I had gone to my office and retrieved it from the file where it had been sitting for 3 years, and I had placed it on the nightstand before anyone came in. It was a medical envelope from the Cincinnati Women's Health Center. It contained the ultrasound reports and the hormone level test results, and the attending physician's notes from the weeks before and after the miscarriage, the specific medical documentation that a woman keeps when she understands that a miscarriage may someday be called a performance. I had put it there the first day, and I had not mentioned it, and she had not mentioned it, and it had sat on the nightstand under the lamp for 3 weeks, while she was fighting cancer in my guest room, and I was bringing her soup. She picked it up on the day she said what she said. She looked at it. She understood what it was. She said, How long have you had this? I said, 3 years. She said, You kept it. I said, Yes. She said, For this conversation. I said, Not specifically for this conversation. For the conversation that needed to happen at some point. I didn't know what point. She said, You thought it might need to speak for itself. I said, Yes. She said, It didn't need to. I said, No. But it was there if it did. She put the envelope back on the nightstand. She picked up the spoon. She finished the soup. That is where I want to start. Now let me take you to the beginning. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the younger of 2 children born to Kwame and Amara Osei, who had come from Ghana in 1984 when my father was accepted into a doctoral program in electrical engineering at Ohio State, and who had built their American life in Columbus, with the particular combination of professional ambition and community rootedness that characterized the Ghanaian immigrant families of their generation in the American Midwest. My father spent his career in engineering and eventually in engineering education, teaching at Ohio State for 22 years and building the specific kind of academic reputation that comes from being both a rigorous researcher and a teacher who understands that the most important thing he can give his students is not the content of the courses, but the particular capacity for systematic thinking that the content is designed to develop. My mother was a nurse practitioner who spent 25 years in the Columbus area in women's health, the specific professional domain of someone who had decided that the health needs of women were what she wanted to spend her working life addressing, and who had built an expertise in the particular combination of clinical care and patient advocacy that women's health requires when it is done well. I want to tell you about my mother specifically before I tell you anything else, because she is the reason the medical envelope exists, and the reason I knew to keep it, and the reason I knew what keeping it meant. She had lost a pregnancy before I was born. This is family history I learned at 22, when I asked her a specific question during a conversation about something else, and she answered it directly in the particular way she answered difficult things, which was without drama and without softening, and with the specific honesty of someone who had spent 25 years telling patients true things that were hard to hear and who did not have a different mode for personal conversations. She said, "Before you were born, yes, between your brother and you. 8 weeks. We didn't know for certain until the next pregnancy whether my body would carry to term." I said, "You never told us." She said, "It wasn't your story to carry. It was mine." I said, "Do you still think about it?" She said, "Sometimes. Less than I used to." The thinking was its own kind of grieving, and the grieving had its own timeline. She said, "The most important thing I learned from it is that the body does things on a schedule that has nothing to do with what you planned or what you wanted or whether you deserve it or not. The body is doing what the body does, and the meaning people put on it is separate from the biology." She said, "People put a great deal of meaning on miscarriages that has nothing to do with the woman who experienced the miscarriage. They use it to say things about what she is, or what she deserves, or what it means about her readiness or her worthiness. All of that is about them and their frameworks. The miscarriage itself is a biological event." She said, "I am telling you this because you are a woman, and you will someday know someone who loses a pregnancy, and you should understand what it is and what it is not." I was 22, and I received what she was saying in the particular way you receive things from your mother at 22, which is to understand that she is saying something important and to file it away in the specific place where important things from your mother go, the place that you return to when the importance becomes relevant. The importance became relevant at 29. I met Daniel Osei-Bonsu at a community organization event in Cincinnati, where I had moved at 25 for a position at a nonprofit that did health access work in underserved communities. The specific combination of my mother's influence and my own interest in public health that had produced this professional direction. Daniel was at the event because he volunteered with the organization. The particular expression of his specific quality of engagement with his community that I understood from the first conversation as genuine rather than performed. He was 30 at the time of the event. He had grown up in Cincinnati, the son of Gloria and Michael Osei, who had emigrated from Ghana 10 years before Daniel was born, and who had built their lives in Cincinnati in the specific way of Ghanaian immigrant families, organized around the church community and the professional achievements of their children, and the particular strong-willed maintenance of family ties that characterized the diaspora community they were part of. I want to describe Daniel accurately before I describe his mother, because he deserves to be known as himself before he is known in relation to what happened. He was a genuinely good man in the specific way of someone who had decided what kind of person he wanted to be, and who practiced being that person consistently rather than only when the practice was easy. He was kind in the particular daily way that kindness expresses itself in small, consistent choices. He was honest in the specific way of someone who understood that honesty required a kind of courage that was easier to sustain if it was practiced habitually rather than reserved for important moments. And he was, when he was at his best, capable of seeing clearly through the specific frameworks that his family and his community had given him, capable of looking at a situation and understanding it on its own terms rather than through the terms he had been given. He was not always at his best. No one is always at their best. And the specific way in which he was not at his best in the first year of our marriage is directly relevant to this story. We married in the fall of the year I turned 30, after 2 years of dating and 6 months of engagement, at a ceremony in Columbus where both families gathered and where the particular combination of Ghanaian and American celebration produced the specific joy of an occasion where everyone present was genuinely happy about the thing being celebrated. Gloria was warm to me at the wedding. Specifically warm, in the way that she was warm to people she had decided to be warm to, and I received the warmth as the genuine welcome of a mother-in-law who had accepted her son's choice. The warmth changed across the first year of the marriage in a way that I noticed and did not fully understand until I understood it. Gloria had specific concerns about me that she expressed to Daniel in the private conversations of a mother and a son, and that Daniel, to his specific credit, and also to his specific failure, did not fully mediate. The concerns were organized around the particular framework that some Ghanaian mothers of her generation applied to the women their sons brought into the family, a framework that assessed women on specific criteria that I want to describe accurately rather than simply. The framework valued, above most things, the specific quality of service to the husband's family. Not service in the sense of subservience, in the sense of someone who understood her primary role as contributing to the harmony and the needs of the family she had married into, and who organized her behavior around that contribution. It valued deference to the mother-in-law in specific ways that were about respect for her position rather than agreement with her views. It valued a particular kind of emotional regulation that communicated stability and the absence of drama and the specific quality of a woman who did not impose her emotional states on the people around her. I was capable of most of these things in the ordinary course of a relationship. I was not capable of performing them under all circumstances regardless of what the circumstances required, and the specific circumstances that tested this were the circumstances of the miscarriage. I became pregnant in the 8th month of our marriage. The pregnancy was not planned in the specific sense that we had not been actively trying, but it was received with the particular joy of something that you did not know you wanted until you had it, and that you immediately understood was exactly right. The pregnancy was confirmed at 6 weeks. The first appointment was at 8 weeks. The ultrasound showed what it showed, which was the specific evidence of a pregnancy that was developing normally. I miscarried at 11 weeks. I want to describe this with the particular honesty that my mother gave me at 22 when she described her own loss, which is without drama and without softening, and with the specific acknowledgement that what happened was a biological event that had its own meaning, independent of anyone's interpretation of it. My body ended the pregnancy at 11 weeks. There was a specific medical process involved that I managed with my OB/GYN and with my mother on the phone, and with Daniel beside me in the specific patient and present way. That was his particular quality when something real was happening. I was devastated in the specific way of someone who had understood for 5 weeks that they were going to be a mother, and who was now not going to be a mother, not yet, and who did not know whether they would be in the future. I cried. I was not functional for several days. I needed to be taken care of in the particular way that devastated people need to be taken care of, which is to have someone present and attentive and not requiring anything. Daniel was exactly what I needed. For the first week. In the second week, something changed in the quality of his presence, not dramatically, the specific quality of someone who is fully present becoming the slightly less specific quality of someone who is present, but also somewhere else simultaneously. I noticed it the way I noticed things, which was with a particular quiet attention that did not immediately express itself. I understood what was happening on the Thursday evening of the second week when Daniel came home from a visit to his mother's house. He sat at the kitchen table with the particular posture of someone who has received information and is trying to figure out what to do with it, and I sat across from him and I said, "Tell me." He said, "I was at my mother's." I said, "Yes." He said, "She said something. I want to be honest with you about what she said because I think you need to know, and because I am not going to manage this between you and my mother at the cost of you not knowing." I said, "Tell me." He said, "She said she was concerned about how you responded to the miscarriage. She said she had spoken with some women in her church community, and some of them had mentioned that they had known women who exaggerated or fabricated grief around miscarriages as a way of getting attention from their husbands. She said she was not accusing you of anything, but that she wanted me to be aware that this was something that happened and that I should be observant." He said, "I told her she was wrong. I want you to know that. I told her she was wrong about you, and that what you were going through was real." He said, "But I also want to tell you what she said, because I think you deserve to know what is happening." I looked at my husband across the kitchen table. I said, "She told you my grief was faked." He said, "She said she wasn't accusing you. She said she was being observant." I said, "Daniel, she told you my grief was faked. The observation and the accusation are the same thing when the observation is that women sometimes fake grief for attention." He said, "Yes, you're right." I said, "What did you say to her specifically?" He said, "I said you were the most genuine person I knew, and that what you were experiencing was real and that I would not entertain the suggestion." I said, "Did she hear that?" He said, "She said she understood and that she was just being careful." I said, "She heard it and she dismissed it." He said, "Yes." I looked at my husband, who was 32 years old, and who had grown up in the particular environment of a Ghanaian household, organized around Gloria's specific understanding of how things worked, and who was, in that moment, doing the particular difficult work of being honest with me about something his mother had said that he did not believe, and that he had challenged, and that he nonetheless felt obligated to tell me because he understood that my knowing was more important than his comfort. I loved him for telling me. I want to say this specifically because the story that follows could be read as a story about a man who failed his wife, and that would be an incomplete reading. He told me. He challenged his mother. He sat across the table from me on a Thursday evening and told me the thing that was most uncomfortable to tell. He also, across the following weeks, in the specific gradual way of someone whose primary attachment relationship and whose mother were applying simultaneous pressures in different directions, allowed the doubt that his mother had planted to live in a small corner of his awareness where it did not express itself directly, but that shaped the specific quality of his presence in ways I noticed. I noticed it because I was paying close attention, and I made a decision about how to respond. The decision was the same decision I had made in smaller forms throughout my adult life, which was to document rather than confront, to keep the accurate record rather than to spend the energy of confrontation on a situation whose resolution required something other than a confrontation. I called my OBGYN's office the Monday after Daniel told me what Gloria had said. I said I needed copies of all the documentation from the pregnancy and the miscarriage, the ultrasound reports and the hormone level tests and the attending physician's notes and everything in the medical record that related to the pregnancy from confirmation to its conclusion. The receptionist asked if I needed them for an insurance claim or a second opinion. I said, "I just want them for my own files." She said she would have them ready in 2 days. I picked them up on Wednesday. I organized them in the specific, careful way of someone who has grown up watching a nurse practitioner organize medical documentation, which is with a logic that makes each piece of information findable and its relationship to the other pieces clear. I put them in a manila envelope from the Cincinnati Women's Health Center. I labeled the envelope with my name and the date range. I put the envelope in the filing cabinet in my office, in the folder between the tax documents and the insurance policies, the particular location of things that needed to be kept, but that I hoped would never need to be retrieved. I told no one about the envelope. Not Daniel, not my mother, not anyone. The envelope was the record, and the record existed because the record needed to exist, and when and whether the record would need to speak was a question I could not answer at the time. 3 months after the miscarriage, I became pregnant again. This pregnancy was different from the beginning in the specific way of a pregnancy that follows a loss, which is that I could not allow myself the particular uncomplicated joy of the first pregnancy, because the first pregnancy had ended, and I understood now, in a way I had not understood before, that pregnancies could end. I was also different in the specific way of someone who is managing their emotional expression more carefully than the situation would otherwise require, because I understood from what Daniel had told me that the specific quality of my emotional response was being assessed, and because I understood, without being able to say it directly, that the assessment had been communicated to Daniel in a way that had left a residue. I did not talk to Daniel about the second pregnancy the way I would have talked to him about it if the first pregnancy had not ended and if his mother had not said what she said. I was more contained, more private with the specific interior experience of being pregnant for the second time after a loss. I kept the difficult moments to myself in the particular way of someone who has understood that expressing them costs something they cannot afford. Daniel noticed this. He said once in the 4th month of the second pregnancy, "You seem more closed off than you were the first time." I said, "I'm being careful." He said, "About what?" I said, "About allowing myself to feel the things I feel. The first time I felt them completely, and then I lost the pregnancy, and I don't know how to feel them completely again yet." He said, "You can be honest with me." I said, "I know." I did not tell him the full truth, which was that the specific thing I was being careful about was the way my emotional responses were being received and assessed and discussed with his mother. That was a truth I could not tell him because telling it would have required a confrontation with the situation that I was not yet ready to have. I carried the second pregnancy with the particular controlled care of someone who is navigating multiple simultaneous requirements, and who has made the specific calculation that the carrying requires more of her than she is currently showing. Mia was born in October, healthy and specific and completely herself from the first moment, with Daniel's eyes and my mother's forehead, and the particular way of looking at the world that newborns have before the world has taught them anything about how to look at it. She was 3 weeks old when Gloria held her for the first time. I watched Gloria hold my daughter, and I watched the specific expression on Gloria's face when she held her, the expression of a grandmother holding a grandchild for the first time, and I understood from the quality of that expression that something was happening in Gloria that was different from anything that had been happening before. She looked at Mia and then she looked at me. She said, "She looks like you." I said, "Yes, I think so." She said, "She has your mouth." I said, "Everyone says that." She said, "It suits her." I said, "Yes." She said nothing else in that specific exchange. She went back to looking at Mia, but in the looking there was something I had not seen before in Gloria's face when she looked at me or said anything to me, which was the particular expression of someone who is encountering a specific situation and who is beginning to understand that the situation is different from what they believed it to be. Let me stop here for a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been in the specific position of having been wronged by someone and then watching that person begin to understand what they did without having confronted them, just through the particular accumulation of reality contradicting their interpretation? And have you had to decide what to do with the watching? Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what happened across the year between Mia's birth and Gloria's cancer diagnosis and what I did with the watching is the specific thing I want you to understand before I tell you about the guest room and the soup. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. The year between Mia's birth and Gloria's diagnosis was the year that the specific accumulated reality of our family life produced the particular conditions for what happened in the guest room. I want to describe this year honestly because I think the honest description is more useful than a simplified account of me patiently being wonderful and Gloria slowly coming around. I was not always patient. There were specific moments when the weight of what Gloria had said and the particular cost of carrying it without confronting it produced in me the specific quality of someone who is managing something effortful and whose management is itself effortful. Daniel noticed these moments. He asked about them occasionally, the particular question of someone who can see that something is happening without knowing the specific thing. I told him, in the January after Mia was born, about the fuller picture. Not as a confrontation or as an accusation, but as the particular honest conversation that needed to happen between a husband and a wife when the wife has been carrying something for 2 years that belongs in the conversation between them. I told him that the reason I had been closed off during the second pregnancy was that his mother's suggestion that my grief was performed had produced a specific residue in our relationship, and that I had been managing that residue throughout the pregnancy by being more controlled about my emotional expression than I would otherwise have been. He was quiet for a very long time after I said this. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "For which part?" He said, "For not doing more to make it clear that what she said had no place in our marriage." I told her she was wrong. I told you what she said. I did not make clear to both of you that it was resolved and over, and that it would not affect how I was present with you. I said, "No, you didn't." He said, "I allowed a doubt to live that should not have been allowed to live." I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to have a conversation with your mother. The one where you tell her specifically what the residue of what she said cost. Not because I need the apology from her, because I need you to have named it clearly to her and to have named it clearly to me that you have named it." He said, "Yes." He had the conversation with Gloria in February. He told me about it afterward in the particular way he told me important things, fully and without managing the difficult parts toward a more comfortable shape. He said, "I told her what you told me, about the second pregnancy and what it cost." She was quiet for a long time. She said she had been aware that something was wrong and that she had not known how to address it. I said the way to address it was to speak to you directly and honestly about what she had said and what it had cost. He said, "She said she would think about how to do that." I said, "She hasn't yet." He said, "No." I said, "It may take time." He said, "It may." I said, "I'm prepared for it to take time." He said, "Why are you prepared for it?" I said, "Because I understand who she is and what it costs her to say the specific true thing about a specific mistake. Not everyone can do it quickly. Some people need more time to arrive at honesty than others. I'm not going to require a timeline." He said, "That is more generous than she deserves." I said, "It's what the situation requires if what I want is the outcome of a real conversation rather than a performed apology that doesn't help anyone." He said, "What outcome do you want?" I said, "I want my daughter to have a grandmother who can be honest with her. Not a grandmother who says the right things, a grandmother who says the true things. That's what I want." He said, "That might take a long time." I said, "I know." Gloria was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in March, 14 months after Mia was born. The diagnosis was the particular kind of diagnosis that changes the specific organization of everything, the kind that reorganizes who is available and who is needed, and what the practical requirements of the next months or years are going to be. Her daughter, Daniel's sister Abina, lived in Atlanta with a demanding job, and 2 young children and a husband, whose own work required his presence in ways that made extended absence from Atlanta complicated. The specific logistics of cancer treatment and recovery do not negotiate with complicated circumstances, and Abina's circumstances were what they were. Daniel and I had a conversation about what the logistics required and what we could offer. The conversation was practical and direct in the particular way of conversations between people who have learned to have the hard conversations without managing them away from what the hard conversations need to address. I said, "She can stay with us during treatment if that's what she needs. The guest room is there." Daniel looked at me. He said, "Amara," I said, "she is your mother, and she is sick, and the practical reality is that we have the room and the flexibility and the capacity to help. Those are the relevant facts." He said, "After what she said." I said, "After what she said?" "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because the answer to what she said is not withholding practical help from a sick 62-year-old woman who needs it. That is not the answer I want to give." He said, "What is the answer you want to give?" I said, "The one I'm giving by offering the room, which is that who I am is not determined by what she said about who I am." He said, "That is a very specific answer." I said, "Yes." He said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure about what I'm doing. I'm not sure about how it will feel when she's here. Those are different things." He said, "Yes, they are." Gloria came to stay with us in January 2 years ago, when the combination of treatment requirements and the inadequate heating in her apartment and Abina's scheduling conflicts produced the circumstances that had no other solution. She arrived on a Saturday morning with 2 suitcases and a dignity that I recognized as the particular dignity of someone who is in a difficult position and who is managing the difficulty without performing either the difficulty or the dignity. I helped her get settled in the guest room. I showed her where things were. I told her the Wi-Fi password and the hot water situation, and the specific timing of when the neighborhood was quiet enough to sleep through. I also put the manila envelope on the nightstand. I put it there before she arrived, while Daniel was getting her from her apartment, and I placed it under the lamp and I left the room and I did not mention it. I want to explain this decision because it is the specific decision that the story has been building toward, and I think the explanation is important. I put the envelope on the nightstand not as a confrontation, not as a display of evidence, not as a statement about the specific wrong that had been done. I put it there because the envelope existed, and because its existence was part of the truth of the situation between Gloria and me, and because I believed that the truth, presented quietly and without elaboration, was the most honest thing I could offer at the beginning of a period of 3 weeks or more, during which we were going to be in the same house every day. I put it there as the opening of a conversation that I believed needed to happen and that I was willing to have when she was ready to have it. She was ready on the Wednesday of the 3rd week. After the soup and the conversation in the guest room, I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because they are the specific texture of what the conversation produced, and they deserve to be described honestly. Gloria stayed with us for 6 weeks total. She was in treatment twice a week, and she rested on the other days, and on the good days she sat in the living room and held Mia and watched the particular form of television she favored, and occasionally helped me in the kitchen in the specific advisory capacity of someone who was not strong enough to stand for long, but who had opinions about how things should be cooked that she expressed with the particular directness of someone who had spent 60 years cooking and who did not see the point of withholding culinary opinions from someone who was clearly open to receiving them. She and I had the conversation I had described to her on the Wednesday of the tomato bisque. Not that day, because that day was the day she said what she said, and I received it, and we established that the conversation needed to happen. The conversation happened on a Saturday afternoon when Daniel had taken Mia to see his father and Gloria, and I were in the house alone. And both of us understood that this was the specific time for the specific conversation. She told me what she had been thinking, and why she had said what she said. The particular fears that had organized her assessment of me, the specific thing she had been afraid of losing, the way the miscarriage had become the instrument of a fear that existed before the miscarriage, and that the miscarriage made into something she could name and act on. I told her what it had cost. Specifically, the second pregnancy and the particular controlled care I had maintained throughout it. The specific things I had not said to Daniel because I could not say them in the environment that her accusation had created. The ways in which the first year of my marriage had been shaped by the residue of what she had communicated. She listened to all of it. She did not manage it toward a more comfortable shape. She sat with it in the particular way of someone who has decided to receive something fully and to let it be what it is. She said, "I made your marriage smaller." I said yes. She said, "Daniel's too." I said yes. She said, "I am sorry for that, specifically for that, not for caring about my son. For the specific mechanism I used." I said, "I know." She said, "The envelope." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long did it take you to get those records?" I said, "I called the Monday after Daniel told me what you said." She said, "You were moving that fast." I said, "My mother taught me to document. She is a nurse practitioner. She understands that the accurate record matters." She said, "Smart woman." I said, "Yes." She said, "She taught you well." I said, "She taught me that the body does things on its own schedule that have nothing to do with what you deserve, and that the meaning people put on the body's events is separate from the biology." She said, "She said that." I said, "When I was 22. Long before any of this." She said, "She was preparing you." I said, "She was teaching me something true. Whether it prepared me was a separate matter." Gloria looked at the envelope on the nightstand. She said, "Can I read it?" I said, "Yes." She read it. The ultrasound reports and the hormone level tests and the physician's notes. She read all of it in the quiet of the Saturday afternoon with Daniel and Mia not yet home from his father's. When she finished, she put it back in the envelope. She said, "This is the most comprehensive documentation of a medical event I have ever seen outside a clinical setting." I said, "I had a reason to document it comprehensively." She said, "Me." I said, "Yes." She said, "Amara, I want to ask you something." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you know when you put that envelope on the nightstand that I would eventually read it and say what I said?" I said, "I hoped you would." I did not know. She said, "What were you going to do if I didn't?" I said, "Leave it there until you did, or take it home eventually and put it back in the filing cabinet." He said, "You would have left it there for weeks without saying anything." I said, "Yes." The envelope was the beginning of the conversation. Whether the conversation happened on the first day or the third week or not at all was up to you. She said, "You gave me the choice." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because the conversation needed to be yours to begin. If I had confronted you, it would have been my conversation, and you would have been responding. What I wanted was a conversation where you were saying what you needed to say because you were ready to say it, not because I had put you in a position where you had to respond." She said, "You waited 3 years for me to be ready." I said, "I was not waiting specifically. I was living my life and keeping the record, and when the circumstances produced the opportunity for the conversation, I made the conditions for it possible, and I waited." She said, "That is an extraordinary amount of patience." I said, "It is what the situation required." She said, "No, it is what you chose to give it. Most people would have required the conversation sooner." I said, "Most people do not have my mother." She said, "No, I suppose they don't." Gloria completed her treatment and returned to her apartment in March of that year. The treatment was specific to her cancer and the specific combination of things that followed treatment in cases like hers, and I am not going to describe the medical details because they are hers rather than mine. What I will tell you is that she went back to her apartment in March and that she called me twice a week from March onward. Not Daniel. Me. The calls were specific. She called to tell me what was happening with the treatment, and to ask how Mia was doing, and to share things that occurred to her across the week that she thought I might find interesting or useful. She called to ask about my work and to share her own. The calls were the particular quality of conversations between two people who have arrived at honesty and who are building something from the honest starting point, which is a different quality from either warmth or correctness and is more durable than either. Mia was 2 years old when the calls began. She is now 3, and she knows her grandmother's voice, and she lights up when the phone rings, and it is Gloria, the specific response of a child who has encountered someone who is genuinely interested in her as a specific person, rather than as a role she is filling. Gloria came for Mia's birthday in October. She stayed for 5 days. On the last night, she and I sat at the kitchen table after Mia and Daniel were asleep, and we talked until midnight in the particular way of people who have moved past the specific formality of a relationship that was managed and who are now simply talking. She said, "I want to tell you something about what happened when I was sitting in your guest room in those first weeks before I said what I said. I said, 'Tell me.' She said, 'I saw the envelope every day. Every day I woke up and it was there, and I knew what was in it without having read it, and I had 2 simultaneous reactions that I want to describe honestly.' I said, 'Go ahead.' She said, 'The first was the reaction of someone who had been proven wrong by documentation. The recognition that the thing I had said was disproven by the thing on the nightstand.' She said, 'The second was the reaction of someone who was encountering for the first time the specific quality of who my daughter-in-law is, which is a woman who keeps the accurate record, who documents, who does not confront, but who does not let the truth disappear.' She said, 'I have spent 62 years in a world where women who kept the accurate record and did not let the truth disappear were called difficult or calculating or cold, because the women in my world who simply accepted what they were told and did not document were considered the good ones.' She said, 'You are not that woman, and I spent the first 2 years of your marriage trying to make you into her.' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'I was wrong about which woman was the good one.' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'The woman who keeps the accurate record and does not let the truth disappear is the woman I should have wanted for my son.' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'And for myself.' She said this last thing quietly, and with the particular quality of someone saying something for the first time that has been taking a long time to arrive at the words. I said, 'Yes. For yourself too.' She said, 'Teach me how you document, how you keep the record.' I said, 'It is not complicated. You decide that the accurate record matters regardless of whether anyone else sees it. You write things down, or you save the documents, or you take the photographs and you put them where they can be found. And you trust that the truth, when it is needed, will speak if you have kept it.' She said, 'The envelope on the nightstand.' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'That's simple.' I said, 'That's specific.' Simple is not quite right. Specific is more accurate. She said, 'Yes, specific. I'll remember that.' Here is what 3 years of a manila envelope in a filing cabinet and 6 weeks of tomato bisque in a guest room taught me. I know that the documentation of the truth is not the same as the deployment of the truth. I kept the envelope for 3 years without showing it to anyone, not because I did not have opportunities to show it, but because showing it at the wrong moment in the wrong way would have turned the truth into a weapon, rather than allowing it to be what it was, which was the accurate record of a specific biological event that had been called something else by someone who was afraid. I know that the patience to wait for the right conditions for a conversation is not the same as the acceptance of a wrong that was done. I waited 3 years for the conditions that produced the Wednesday of the tomato bisque, and the waiting was not resignation. It was the particular active patience of someone who was maintaining the record and building her own life, and being present with her husband and raising her daughter and trusting that the moment when the conditions were right would arrive. I know that offering the guest room to the person who wronged you is not generosity in the sense of giving something you are not obligated to give. It is the specific statement of who you are when the person who wronged you encounters who you are rather than what they said about you. The guest room and the tomato bisque were not gifts to Gloria. They were the particular expression of someone who had decided that her identity was not determined by what Gloria had said about her, and who was demonstrating that determination in the most practical and specific form available. And I know that my mother, who told me at 22, that the body does things on its own schedule that have nothing to do with what you deserve, and that the meaning people put on the body's events is separate from the biology, was right about both things, and that she also taught me, without knowing she was teaching me anything specific, to document, to keep the record, to trust that the truth, preserved carefully and available when it was needed, would speak when it needed to speak. The envelope is back in the filing cabinet between the tax documents and the insurance policies. I have not looked at it since the Saturday afternoon when Gloria read it in the guest room. It is there if anyone ever needs it. It is also there because the accurate record is always worth keeping regardless of whether it is ever needed. My mother taught me that. That is my story. A manila envelope from a doctor's office, 3 years in a filing cabinet, a guest room and a cancer diagnosis, and 6 weeks of tomato bisque from my mother's recipe. And a Wednesday afternoon when the woman who had told my husband my grief was faked sat in my guest room and read the medical documentation of the thing she had called a performance. If this reminded you of something you documented carefully, not because you had a plan for it, but because the accurate record was what the truth deserved, and of the specific moment when the documentation became the opening of the conversation that needed to happen, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who is carrying something quietly, and who needs to know that keeping the record is itself a form of dignity, and that the truth, preserved accurately, speaks when it is needed. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.